Okay, so good evening, good evening in the UK where I'm based, good afternoon in America where Chiara and Kate are based, good morning perhaps. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just going to introduce the event briefly before handing over to Chiara and Kate. So my name's Anthony Morgan. I edit a journal called The Philosopher. It's based in the UK. It's been running for almost 100 years. And we normally run a in-person lecture series in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I'm based, and sometimes in London, sometimes in other parts of the country. And obviously with the lockdown, we decided to go online, and it's a wonderful example to invite people who would be rather difficult to get in the UK. So tonight we've got Kate Manne in conversation with Chiara Ricciardone, and I'm obviously really delighted about this. So I'll start by introducing Chiara, and Chiara can in turn introduce Kate. So Chiara is the US commissioning editor for the journal, and it's been a real pleasure to work with her these past 2 years. Earlier this year, she produced a wonderful guest edited issue of the journal on the theme of questioning power. And if you look in the chat function, there is a link to it, and we put a discount just for today. So if you wanted to get a copy. There's also a list to the Activist Graduate School, which Chiara has co-founded, and there's a few other links to things like Kate's book and various other things. So just for the format of the evening, I'm going to hand over to Kate and Chiara in just a second, and if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Chiara and Kate will speak together for 30, maybe more minutes before moving on to the question and answers part of the evening. So I think I've said everything I need to. I don't think I've missed anything important out. So now I will bring in Kate and Chiara, hopefully, and we can start the evening off.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And thank you so much, Kate, for being here. It's such an extraordinary pleasure to get to talk to one of the world's top thinkers, not top under 40, not top women, but just top thinkers, according to Prospect magazine. And the cliche, in this case, we have them because they are true. Sometimes Kate hardly needs any introduction whatsoever. It is very rare for a philosopher to make headlines as she did with her first book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, in 2017. And her second book, it's a really less good visual on my e-reader, sorry about that, but that's the way that I read it. So it's called Entitlement, How Male Privilege Hurts Women. And it, in the first book, if the first book famously describes misogyny as the police force arm of patriarchy, or the shock collar, as she calls it in the second book, really vividly, Entitled focuses on the flip side, which is what that system of norms that govern what men and women each feel entitled to receive or not receive, and those norms that, when violated, trigger the police force of misogyny to take effect and step in and start policing those norms. So Kate, thank you so much for being here. I know between COVID-somnia and a 10-month-old baby, you must be tired. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much to Anthony, to you, Chiara, for having this conversation with me, and to everyone attending. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Same shout out. I'm happy that we have the audience here to catch me on all the questions I will surely not think of. But I wanted to start with what's the seismic event that has happened since the major writing of your book, which everyone is still coping with. And that's, I'm wondering how you've seen your arguments borne out in the new COVID reality, or in what ways the new reality is testing your thinking and asking you to push in new directions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly been a time that's really highlighted one of the dynamics that I discuss in a chapter of this book, which is the uneven division of labor in the home between men and women. So when I was doing research for this chapter, I was shocked to find that women do roughly twice as much work as men in the average heterosexual household when both partners work full time. And that encompasses domestic chores, child rearing labor, and it also encompasses a more intangible thing, emotional labor, carrying the mental load of figuring out what needs doing, and keeping track and doing the anticipatory work of keeping a household running. And I think COVID-19 has really cast that dynamic into sharp relief and highlighted just how unfair and detrimental to women's lives, mental health, careers, is that unfair division of labor that I attribute to a men's sense of entitlement to their leisure and women's labor.
Absolutely, yeah. The revolution may not be televised, but women's work is now going to be Zoomed because we're all having our children interrupt these Zoom calls all the time.
So apt.
And so that's the other major rupture that's happened since the publication of this book is whether my son's birthday was yesterday, and so I was reflecting back on his birth. Thank you. He's 5, and you know, that day it's like trauma. It's like miracle. It's so life changing. And so I was thinking about you, and I was like, oh wow, how is this change impacting all those ideals and ideas that she set forth in her book? Can you speak to how mother is changing your thinking?
Absolutely. So, you know, it's been a big change. You know, I have, as Chiara mentioned, a now nearly 10-month-old daughter. And I guess one of the things that I've been really happy about is that it has, it's shown something that to me, some people insisted was not possible, which is really egalitarian parenting. So I've been really happy to, you know, to genuinely co-parent with my husband and fall in love with this little girl together and both do the hard work that it takes to get to know a baby. So yeah, it's been something where for all the people who said that my ideals or his ideals or our ideals would be challenged by co-parenting, it's actually, I think, been a really lovely journey of seeing them come to fruition in caring for our baby.
That's wonderful. I'm so happy that you have that support, and I'm happy for her as well. It starts now. So, but besides these two world shifts and personal shifts, there's really an intellectual journey that happens between the two books. Some things have stayed the same, some things are different. One thing that I noticed is I noticed that you being really circumspect in the early pages of Down Girl and really being careful about who you were speaking for and limiting yourself to the milieu from which you come and not wanting to overreach in terms of who you could speak for and about. And I see you in Entitlement taking more risks to be able to use your privilege to try to speak to and for other communities to which you don't with which you don't identify, but that you still want your analysis to be able to serve. So that's one thing I noticed, but I'm curious how you see it from your perspective, the arc between the two books, things that have changed, things that have stayed the same.
Well, I really appreciate that observation. I felt like a lot of my intellectual journey over the past 4 or 5 years has been really paying attention in ways that were always vital, but which I'd kind of neglected to pay adequate attention to, the voices of trans women, Black women, women from other minority demographics, and trying to be a little bolder in this book by actually saying something substantive about the nature of trans misogyny, say, which I, drawing on work by the trans philosopher Talia May Betcher, among other people, I trace some of the most pernicious forms of transmisogyny to a sense of entitlement to be able to read someone's genital arrangements off their gendered appearance. And so that is a kind of bolder move that I could, of course, get this horribly wrong. And as a cis and white woman, I could fail to do justice to these phenomena. But I felt like, having paid attention to the conversations that I think of as so important and central to thinking about misogyny, I could say a bit more and be a bit bolder, even if there was a risk of getting things wrong, and that it was worth taking that risk.
Yeah, intellectual risk is a real thing, especially these days. They write it into the contract, right? If your book causes an undue stir, we can pull it for any reason. This is a real thing. So what I wanted to speak in a related way to that point, which is that your book does take on, entitled misogyny in so many different sites. We see how it's operating in the US presidential election. We see how it's operating in the hospital, where Black women's pain and women's pain is severely discounted and not acknowledged. We're seeing it in mass murders like the Isla Vista killings and other violence and murders by involuntary celibates, or incels as they're called. I had to explain to my parents what incels were when I was talking about this event. And so they were like, that's real. And I was like, yeah. So
unfortunately.
But one thing I was wondering is how you would respond to someone who's saying, can the concept of entitlement really explain what's going on in all these different situations? Isn't the intimacy of the bedroom really such a different situation than what plays out in the political sphere? Can we really say that that's the same kind of dynamics going on?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'm trying to do, that I think your question so nicely picks up on, is offer a framework that is in some ways surprisingly simple, and offers to explain quite a lot on the basis of a surprisingly simple analysis. So the idea is something like, still within even superficially egalitarian societies like the US and the UK today, as well as my home country of Australia, there's still a pernicious and pervasive sense that men are entitled to, especially privileged men, are entitled to really all valuable human goods. And those include things like sex, most obviously, but still more insidiously, there are things like care, attention, affection, admiration, even consent, which raises interesting issues about sexual ethics. Consent becomes necessary but far from sufficient for ethical sex. And also things like power and claims to knowledge. And all of those valuable goods on this framework are something which men are deemed more entitled to than their similarly or less privileged female counterparts, and which designated women are deemed obligated to give to these men and not to take away from them. So it's a kind of a pretty simple give-take framework, but I think hopefully the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the chapters show how these apparently like very disparate spheres of life, there's actually intimate connections between gendered unfairnesses that occur in these disparate spheres, or so I tend to think.
Yeah, and I think one of the strengths of your book is the amazingly clear writing that is always bringing it back to this central idea. And it's your gift for language. One of the places it really shows through is in the coinage of new terms, such as himpathy, which is, I've wrestled with a little bit. I'm like, it's such an ugly word, and I'm like, it does so much good work. So I want to talk a little bit about your coinage of new words, and at the same time, I want to, well, let's start with that. Let's start with the coinage of the word himpathy, and that predilection in general, maybe for do we have to make up new words to understand what's going on?
I mean, so we don't have to. It's not like I think that they achieve something that no concepts strung together could get at, because I define the terms and offer a kind of complete definition using other words. But what I think they do is, I hope at least, that they crystallize something that it's hard to put your finger on, and it's hard to identify the pattern until you have a term that names the phenomenon very neatly and discreetly. And in a way, like, it is kind of an annoying word, but it's a very annoying phenomenon. And so there's something about being able to call out himpathy in a kind of, in a skeptical, somewhat cynical way that, you know, I hope it is useful for people who are looking for these patterns. But for me, at least, I had trouble identifying them before I had the term. And I should say, for those of you who haven't heard the term before, I think of himpathy as the disproportionate or undue sympathy, often extended to privileged men who commit acts of sexual assault, sexual harassment, other forms of misogynistic violence or similar, the sympathy for them over their female victims. So
the striking case for me was the what was his name, Brock, the Stanford swimmer. Yeah,
that was actually when I coined the term, with the help, actually, funnily and ironically enough, of my husband. I was going for mempathy. I had the concept, but, you know, himpathy was catchier. And yeah, I was sort of struggling with androphilia, mempathy, and I said, Daniel, like, what works? And he was like, himpathy, boom. There you go.
Credit
so anyway,
to the husband.
credit where it's due. He doesn't get enough credit for it. And I would be remiss if I said, if I didn't say that I felt so sorry for him about the joke. JK.
Well, is he really entitled to the the attention of the
but yeah, I think having these terms for these kind of cases, where in the case of Brock Turner, the judge said, you know, looks like he generally had a good character, despite the fact that he'd been caught in the act of, and this is, I should extend a trigger warning to those who are listening and would appreciate a trigger warning for sexual assault. But Turner had been caught in the act of sexually assaulting a young woman, Chanel Miller, behind a dumpster after a Stanford frat party. And he was caught in the act, and there was no question about what he'd done, really. But the judge was still incredibly lenient on him. His family and friends still kind of portrayed him as a good guy. His father said what a shame it was he could no longer enjoy a fresh ribeye steak off the grill, having lost his appetite. You know, all of this, you know, poor thing. People talked about his swimming prowess instead of focusing on what he'd done to the victim. Again, Chanel Miller, who wrote a brilliant book about this called Know My Name. And anyway, just seeing the ways in which our sympathetic lens homed in on this white privileged male perpetrator and ended up being concerned for his bright future, rather than concerned for his victim and possible future victims. That was really eye-opening to me.
Yeah, it's in that case, I found it to be a really helpful concept as well. And we could cite hundreds of other cases that have occurred since, I think, in different spheres. There were places for me in your book where it was less clear cut. And the way I want to, and I saw this conflict between feminist values and humanist values. And I'm wondering if so I always remember something that Ashwini Tambe, a women's studies scholar at the University of Maryland, said once about, she divided people into people who want to expand the values of humanism and those who think that those universal values need to be given up on because they in some way are really just a cloak for all the things that have gone under the name of humanism but have really been colonialism, sexism, and capitalist exploitation. And so when I'm working my way around to your analysis of the comedian Sarah Silverman, and on Twitter somebody said something really nasty to her, and she responded with compassion. She went and read his Twitter feed. She saw that she was in pain. I believe she donated some money to his rehab program. And this is a case where you're pointing out, and she was celebrated for that. And so you're pointing out that the reason perhaps that she was celebrated for that is because she's playing into the expectations about what that man is entitled to. That man is entitled to our sympathy and our compassion. That man is entitled, even though he was gratuitously rude and violent to somebody he had never met, when she played along with the idea that men are entitled to the good thing of our sympathetic appraisal of that, then she was celebrated. So I thought you were really right on. But at the same time, there was part of me that thought, well, compassion is still a higher value. Like at a moment when things are very polarized and very tense, I am nervous about signing on to something that says that I wouldn't be trying to understand somebody that I disagree with. Where do you fall out on this question of feminism versus humanism? Are they in conflict?
Yeah, no, that's a great, really important question. You know, I think in the particular case, what I wanted to highlight was there's a sense in which being compassionate towards a man who, for no reason and with no explanation, called Sarah Silverman the C word, there's a sense in which that's actually not compassion. That's not compassionate to the next woman this man deals with, who will be beholden to his sense that he's entitled to compassionate and sympathetic treatment, or at least he could be, have this sense of entitlement to sympathetic, compassionate treatment, when in fact he hasn't done something like ask for help. He hasn't actually, you know, made himself vulnerable and shown his pain. Rather, he's evinced his pain unwittingly by being angry, insulting, and abusive. And so the next woman who has to deal with him, in a way, it doesn't do other people who are vulnerable like that potential woman any favors to, I think, minister to someone's abusive outbursts. Which is kind of why I made the claim about that case that I did, that there's something misguided, albeit well-intentioned, about extending compassion towards people who are abusive towards you. But that being said, I think, you know, many feminine coded values that I talk about in this book and the last, like compassion, kindness, being caring, being communal, I mean, those are absolutely central moral virtues. And even though it's true that we sometimes expect women to do too much by way of compassionate, caring work, I would be the last person to argue that those aren't genuine, important virtues. Rather, I think that often men should be required, or at least encouraged, to manifest those virtues much more, and that we should all be careful about who we extend care, compassion, and sympathy to. So are we extending those humanistic virtues in the direction of the most vulnerable people who really need our care and compassion? Or are we misguidedly, albeit well-intentioned, are we extending those to people who are in fact dominant social actors, often in the form of white men, who are trained, socialized to feel overly entitled to the benefit of those virtues? So I'd say both, yeah, we need to be careful about who we ask to do that work, that moral work, and also who is the beneficiary of that moral work. That, I think, is what it's worth paying attention to when we ask about the value of those genuine virtues.
Yeah, I see your salient move there as really being to expand the conversation about who's receiving care there beyond the two principal persons involved to the imagined community of people who are affected by that kind of interaction on a public stage, and counting their rights in the sense when we're counting up who gets care and compassion. And so I think that makes good sense to be broad-minded about the affected parties in a sense. I want to touch on a raw moment from the book, a question that you weren't able to answer in it, that I think follows in a general thread. It's in chapter 4, on the entitlement to consent, just distinct, by the way, from the chapter on entitlement to sex. And you tell the story of a woman who had unwanted sex with her husband for 8 years. And she's struggling to understand how he could have wanted that or enjoyed that or at all. And you wrote, well, the reason is that he was entitled. He felt entitled to your consent, even unwilling consent. But she also asked in some writing about it long after the divorce, she wrote, how do you assert your agency when its price is the pain of others? And you wrote that you had no real answer at the time of writing. And so I keyed in on that as a moment where you're being vulnerable about the fact that you didn't know the answer, but also as a moment maybe to continue the conversation and see, why is that such a hard question to answer? Is it because it's very difficult for women to say we're entitled to cause pain?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. And it was a particularly raw question for me because my bread and butter, my training is as a moral philosopher, as an ethicist. And, you know, I walk into my classroom, well, not currently, but Zoom into classroom on the first day. And the most basic observation that I make and that I try to make my students feel alive to is that suffering is bad and that there's something good about preventing and ameliorating suffering. And one of the very difficult lessons and one of the kind of underappreciated radical things about a feminist perspective is you realize that there are some kinds of pain that it's actually not, there isn't moral reason not to cause them. So the pain that a man might feel upon being sexually rejected, for example, I tend to believe that's no reason not to just say no. And of course, women are socialized to believe otherwise, but it's also quite a radical thing to say that certain kinds of pain that stem from a sense of entitlement to sex, to consent, to admiration, to all the rest of it, that will cause pain if that sense of entitlement isn't satisfied. But nonetheless, as women, we're not obligated in any way. There isn't even a reason to try to satisfy someone's illicit sense of entitlement. That's a big thing to say. But I think it is part of a feminist perspective, at least it's part of my feminist perspective, that there are some kinds of pain it's not bad to cause. But I have to sit with that a lot because it's a counterintuitive, surprising result.
I think the result of it can be, the counterintuitiveness of it can be lessened a little bit when we make a parallel to white fragility and critical race studies.
Absolutely.
And thinking about, well, if I stake a claim about a racist behavior that's going on, then that's going to trigger someone's white fragility. They're going to feel really upset because white people are feel entitled to their comfort and to being treated with respect at all times. And they don't want to have that be interrupted and be called what is one of the worst words in the American English language, even though it's such a major problem, which is racist. Do you see your work as in dialogue with critical race studies? Do you find sustenance in race studies approaches to inequality and systems of oppression? Or what's the relationship there?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the people who have inspired me the most as writers are people who really can be regarded as founders of critical race theory, people like Charles Lawrence III with his epidemiological approach to racism. I am just a huge fan of Derek Bell, who, I think had a similar and kind of, in some ways, very subversive approach to this question of why white people are so fragile. And he answered, and in at least, papers like Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory, he answered, they're afraid of Black excellence. And it's not that they have some woefully mistaken view of who Black people are or what they can do. It's that they see it's so obvious that Black folks are doing amazing things in the world, and that scares white people. And so it's this very subversive, very frank, and I think, yeah, it very much inspired my approach to the topic of misogyny broadly, but also this question of what do we do with fragile white people, I think is similar to the question of what do we do with toxic and emotional white men. It's hard to, you know, for me, it's a hard won conclusion, but I am inspired by critical race theorists as well as Black feminists to say this, this really isn't a kind of pain that we can minister to without feeding into a pernicious cycle where people feel more and more entitled to have their worldview not disrupted when they badly need for it to be disrupted, and when the most important thing is that certain minorities, for, you know, both people of color as well as white women, the important thing is that we are granted our entitlement to say what is true or what is right, even when that does cause pain or consternation or discomfort.
Yeah, thank you. I'm taking notes on some of the articles that you're recommending. And I'm also, I'm thinking hard about what you said earlier about walking into a classroom and trying to teach people about a moral intuition, basically. And this is really where you situate your work, even though what makes your work so unique, I think, is your willingness to go outside of your traditional spheres of analytic philosophy to reach to culture, to reach to literature, to reach to critical race theory and find the patterns. But one place that you don't so far reach is to the political sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And the place this came up for me was in the last chapter. You end entitled with a list of things that you want your daughter to feel entitled to. So it includes you hope that she feels entitled to feel pain, entitled to bodily autonomy, entitled to support, entitled to change her gender, entitled to take up space and be loud and to be powerful. It's a moving list. But strikingly absent is anything about equal pay or equal representation. It's just sort of the fundaments, I would say, of equality and overcoming of misogyny. So why confine yourself to the moral and social spheres when in other parts of your work you seem willing to push yourself beyond where you're comfortable?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I had thought about whether there should be in this book an entitlement to money, to compensation chapter. I think it's a really good question. I actually, my sense is in doing some preliminary research on this, that the pay gap is such a complicated issue, and it's so much more complicated economically than women making 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. There's actually something I think quite misleading about that statistic. And, you know, I'd also chatted with people who are writing whole books on the pay gap and had found that, you know, it really turns out to affect particular kinds of women exclusively. So women of color, women of color with children in particular, and many, many other intersecting factors that I think would make a fascinating book, but felt like I wasn't sure I could quite do it justice in a single chapter. And so what I end up saying at the end of the book is sort of a list of things that is so far from comprehensive, but it's meant to be a series of pushbacks to the kinds of things that I've identified throughout the book, which is, you know, a series of chapters of things I found I could say, given my own areas of expertise, which are limited. You know, I had chapters on the entitlement to sex, consent, care, medical care, domestic labor, power and knowledge, among other things, where those were areas where I felt I had the ability to say something responsible. And then I wanted to say to my daughter, you actually are entitled in all of those domains to more than society deems your due, as well as you're having crucial obligations to help more vulnerable others, especially for her non-white women, who she, as a white woman, will be responsible for fulfilling her hefty set of obligations toward. And I wanted her to be I want her to be oriented to that rather than a set of spurious obligations towards men. But yeah, that's a long way of saying it's kind of beyond my pay grade, ironically.
Oh, don't undersell yourself. There's still time.
Which I guess time.
Well, yeah, well, that's my next question, which is there something in the works? What can we look forward to from Kate Manne?
So I've become really interested in this question of masculine and feminine coded spheres of political life. And what I'm really interested in the moment is this idea that the government is widely perceived by many people, mostly conservatives and Republicans, as responsible for doing a set of very masculine coded things. They're perceived as responsible for waging wars, building walls, protecting borders, and perhaps above anything, policing people. And those are a set of strenuously masculine coded spheres. Whereas when it comes to the feminine coded things that a state might do, such as providing education, providing care, health care, elder care, and also caring for the environment. Those are all feminine coded things which are perceived by many as totally illegitimate things for a government to do. And so I have this kind of idea of the macho state, a state that is only allowed to do these often quite destructive masculine coded things and not allowed to do the incredibly important feminine coded work that then goes by the wayside to the detriment of everyone. So that's kind of an idea I've been just in a very preliminary way mulling over and trying to think through.
We'll look forward to hearing more. I'm seeing a lot of interesting questions starting to bubbling up in the chat for a long time. So I just wanted to ask one more thing before starting to funnel in the audience into the conversation and enrich it and broaden it that way, which is sort of for me. It's how do you do what you do on Twitter? Do you have rules for engagement? Because this is one of the amazing things, right? You write clearly, you think hard, and then you appear in the public sphere with courage and grace. And that's a hard thing to do. So do you have guidelines? What do you do about that?
Thank you. I so appreciate that, those nice words. I try to think about a couple of things. I try to do it both for myself and for predominantly other girls and women who might be watching and might feel somewhat emboldened by seeing someone push back and not be cowed by misogynistic trolling. I also, so that's one thing. I do it for myself and other women. I never see it as my responsibility to educate men who are behaving badly, or for that matter, sometimes women who are behaving badly, since women can also be part of misogynistic discourse occasionally, or more than occasionally, but it's somewhat more occasional online, I feel like. Another thing I try to do is I actually don't, I never single out or go after other women. I don't do much calling out in general of other people, but occasionally I'll call attention to a man's particularly egregious bad behavior. But because misogyny thrives on a lack of female solidarity and women piling on to already overly hefty attempts to moralize about a woman's admittedly bad behavior, I try not to contribute to that. So I have just a rule for myself that I try to always target systems of oppression and not women who are in some way complicit within the misogynistic systems.
So I want to pull out a couple of questions from the audience that I think extend in this direction. One is from Carla Guilfoyle. She asks, do you consider women who perpetuate ideas that are misogynistic as empowering, in scare quotes, as victims or perpetrators of the system that keeps women down? An example might be women's defense of raunch culture and pornography that almost entirely caters to the male gaze. And I see as related Emily O'Rourke, and I can't quite manage both the chat and the Q&A, but Emily O'Rourke was asking, what do you make of the Karen discourse? Is it misogyny?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, as to the question of whether women are their victims or perpetrators, I think they're really both, and that's perfectly compatible. You know, I think it's important to see that women can both have a lot of internalized misogyny that does them as women a real disservice, and they can be policing and punishing other women at the same time. And I think that's sadly not uncommon. Once we've internalized misogynistic mores, it's quite natural to perpetuate them against other women, and it's especially concerning when there are other more vulnerable women. That being said, there are also legitimate and important criticisms to make of other women sometimes, especially white women like me who can behave themselves in or ourselves in toxic and entitled ways. And I think some of the Karen discourse that calls out white women who are essentially or typically adverting to white male superiors or quote unquote superiors in the form of the police or some other kind of authority, the proverbial manager. I think it can be quite legitimate to call out women who are doing that and thereby satisfying the Karen description. Of course, sometimes Karen discourse does shade into the misogynistic, and it has a misogynistic history on subreddit. It got much of its on the subreddit forum where the discourse got much of its traction. It had misogynistic elements. It was a man who was in various ways seemingly quite derogatory and perhaps abusive towards his ex-wife named Karen. So I think it's actually one of those terms that can be used as a tool for social good or a tool for social ill. And we have to be really, really careful to watch how it's used, why, when, and by whom.
Yeah, context is crucial. That's really interesting. I didn't know that about the history of the term. I'm going to go look that up. Since we're a little bit touching on the relationships and tensions between feminism and racism, anti-race work, Ragini Srinivasan is asking, thanks for this great conversation. I'd like to ask Kate about the relationship between her argument for misogyny as a system of hierarchy enforcement and Isabel Wilkerson's recent work to re-specify racism as caste, which is, of course, also a system of hierarchy enforcement. How are Kate and Isabel Wilkerson thinking systems/structures similarly and differently? And or what does the coincidence of these arguments suggest about the current public understandings of or receptivity to arguments about structures? I don't know Isabel Wilkerson's work, do you?
Yeah, I have the book currently on my coffee table at the top of the pile, but I have to admit I haven't got into it yet just due to pandemic-related childcare shortages. So I will say that from what I can tell, it looks excellent and gives an analysis of racial hierarchies that, from what I understand, is a really crucial and important intervention. One thing I would just caution, and I think this may apply to some of Wilkerson's work, but I'll leave that to those who've actually read the book to judge. Sometimes there's a way of presenting prejudice, bigotry, biases as produced by a form of othering. And, you know, caste classically has been theorized as the result of a set of othering practices. And I know Wilkerson also draws on work suggesting caste involves dehumanization of those in the lowest castes. And I I think that's not the right way to think about gender in all of its intersections with race. Women are very much pivotal, central, vital to this functioning of white supremacist heteropatriarchy. They're not really others, they're regarded as central, but as having a particular set of roles, obligations that correspond to a set of male entitlements. So I tend to think that women are regarded as all too human, and as not an other in any sense that would support spatial segregation. They're thoroughly incorporated into patriarchal households, but are seen as having a particular place and a stringent set of obligations within them. And that when women don't, or are perceived as not playing that role correctly, that's perceived as subverting the gendered hierarchy and leads to misogynistic punishment and reprisal all too often. So that's a somewhat different path towards inhumane treatment that doesn't go via othering or dehumanization or spatial segregation.
Mm. Yeah, and someone else is asking about the case book too in the Q&A, and Schoenberg. So just to double up, everyone should put that on their reading list. Mm-hmm. Rebecca Clark is asking, you've previously said that I am, quote, I am political before I am philosophical. I was wondering if you could expand on this.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I guess what I mean by that is that I'm interested primarily, and I mean political in a very broad sense that encompasses the moral and the social. I'm interested in trying to do justice to lived experiences in a way that reflects the political structures in which we live. And any philosophy that kind of ignores those social structures, that ignores those lived experiences, or that tries to abstract away from the rich phenomena of everyday life, it's lived in a highly hierarchical and oppressive society. I have very little time for that kind of abstract and apolitical philosophy, especially as applied to moral matters.
Yeah, if philosophy can change the world, we should do that. Open thesis.
Amen.
Let's give it a shot, though. Kate Birmingham, thanks for putting on this event. Related to Chiara's point about whether feminism and humanism are in conflict, I'd like to hear more about how you theorize solidarity and interpersonal obligations between people who experience the violence of misogyny and patriarchy. Part of what's unfair about sexism and misogyny is that women and vulnerable people have to do extra work for each other because of patriarchal violence. How do we avoid depleting ourselves without abandoning each other?
Yeah, no, that's a great, and I mean, I wish I had a better answer to this question. I think it more than anything opens up a set of really difficult questions for activists of all kinds, me included, to think through. You know, one thing structurally that would really help is if, you know, instead of thinking about allyship in some of the more reductionist and uninteresting ways that we do think about it, I wonder how things would change if we thought about privileged white men as responsible for restoring the reserves of people who are otherwise depleted, and as having really strenuous service obligations towards others by way of, if you like, historical reparations. That would be a kind of revolution if we thought not just of women supporting other women or people of color supporting other people of color, but what if a lot of support came from a historically unusual direction of privileged white men who regarded themselves as responsible for other more vulnerable and depleted people. So I think that's an idea worth thinking about, to take some of the burden away from those who are already overburdened.
Mm. Can I ask you too, to follow up on that? People are asking, how did Kate get the courage to step out of the straitjacket of analytic philosophy. But also you had mentioned that the process of your second book, that you were able to do more self-care, a little bit healthier of a process.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, we've stuck really to the political and the philosophical, but there's a moment here where people are wanting to know, like, how does she do it? Like, what's behind this? Is she a yogi? Like, what is it?
Oh, that's a nice thing to ask. I'm definitely not. You know, I guess in some ways, I'm a very willful person, and so I just write about what I'm interested in, and it didn't in some ways take much by way of personal courage or conviction to write outside this domain. I was just really I really care about this, and I am a headstrong person who does what I want, probably much too often. In terms of, I will say I find writing about this subject matter compelling but really upsetting. So when I write about misogyny and male entitlement, I feel very distressed a lot of the time. I have trouble self-regulating, and yeah, I mean, I was in a state of immense distress, the most I have been in my life, while I was writing Down Girl. And the second book, I just couldn't go back to that dark place. So I just balanced my writing practices, where I realized that, much to my chagrin, I couldn't write for 16 hours a day about this stuff. I really had to balance working on this material with being very gentle to myself, and doing a lot by way of just, self-care practices, like, gentle walks, and, reading nonfiction, and
are you reading are you reading fiction now?
Oh, I wish I had time with my baby. I feel like my reading days are somewhat in the past, but yeah, still have time for bad television.
Like what?
I did go on a terrible Love is Blind jag recently. I must admit that.
I have also very little time for television, but I worked in a few episodes of I May Destroy You, which
I've heard that's
really compelling, but it's intense. So maybe not the relaxing thing you're looking for with a young baby right now. So back to other people and their questions. I think I'm gonna. There's tons and tons of questions still, but I think the ones that I would want to really draw out as kind of a end spot for us is Frankie Huang and another person are asking, where was it? They're asking basically about how to introduce feminism to those with understanding of it, no understanding of it, or even to somebody who really doesn't seem to have any sense of their behavior as problematic. Where do you, and the reason I want to bring this up is because Katie Kadu is asking, is your book, basically her question is this book really only for people who already agree that entitlement is a problem? Or is there a way, how do we reach people who don't already agree that misogyny, patriarchy, entitlement are a problem? That's the first of these questions I'm bringing together.
No, I do love that question, because I think it's really hard to give someone a picture if they're not already, like, at least like edging up to the side of it to take a peek. I think my hope is that, although this book in some ways is primarily written for other girls and women who are receptive to the message, with the thought that it's often difficult to crystallize inchoate feminist beliefs that I think many of us who are privy to this conversation today share. Even though we might have those beliefs in an inchoate way, I often at least benefit from writers who crystallize that message and try to make it clearer and more readily articulable. So my hope was to try to be part of that general collective feminist effort to do that, albeit a small part of that rich ongoing conversation that does that crystallizing work. That being said, I think this book, more so than my first book, is something that could be given to someone who doesn't get the pervasiveness and the perniciousness of male entitlement. And if they're willing to at least approach the subject matter with an open mind, I hope might give them a picture of what, of just how sweeping and multifaceted it is. So that's my my hope. But of course, there are many excellent books out there that can do similar kinds of work. And yeah, it. But of course, there are for truly reluctant people who really don't want that message. I'm not sure what can be done.
Well, I would add to that also that because there are so many ways in your book that somebody might come across, might be interested in the Islavista killings for some, just because it is so grisly, and then find the pattern compelling, find that it was related to something that they hadn't thought of before. And so I think that your work offers a lot of ways in. And I know that it's touched me and touched people that I know to rethink their relationships and their place in the world. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna leave you with thank you so much. And anyone should, of course, should feel free to sign off that has to go. I think we're due to wrap up in a couple minutes, but I did want to ask if this is become a signature question for me that I stole from other people, which is, what question should I be asking you? What's the question that you wish that didn't come up from me, that didn't come up from the Q&A, that you wish you had the opportunity to raise, even if you don't have an answer for it?
Yeah. I mean, the question, it's a question, I'll put it like this, that I'm in a way glad didn't come up, but I think it's fair to ask me is, what's the solution to all of this mess? And I think my hope is that what this book shows is that the solution will have to be quite piecemeal, that male entitlement and the misogyny it leads to has really pervaded so many facets of our lives that there's going to have to be this really widespread and intensely collective effort of undoing. And that's why, for anyone who's noticed, the chapters of the book all have some kind of negative in the title. So, you know, it goes from involuntary to unexceptional to unassuming to undespairing, and everywhere in between. And the idea of that is really meant to be, goodness, we have a lot of undoing work ahead of us. And often people say, well, you know, they want a bit more of a silver, is that how you say, silver bullet, magic bullet by way of a solution to this mess. And it's like, we've got this whole rich and hoary, gnarly edifice that has to be chipped away at. And so that undoing work, together with the question of what to put in place of patriarchy, of white supremacist heteropatriarchy, that's just this enormous, messy, tangled question. But we have to figure it out.
I'm like, democracy by sortition, democracy by lot will solve everything. No, I think this is where it would be interesting to see if you take a political turn in your next book and see if some of those structural and political changes can do some of the work at the subjective and moral level that you've been working at. But Kate, thank you so much. So fascinating. Your work is such a just unqualified good in the world. And thank you everyone for your questions and for showing up to take time to think in this world. And thank you, Anthony, for putting it on. It's really great.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for an amazing conversation, and so much for everyone's engagement. Just wonderful to see this great turnout. Thank you.
I know. I miss the audience. I wish I could see your faces.
Yeah, me too. I wish that were possible. And thank you so much, Anthony, for facilitating and hosting. I'm deeply appreciative.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and thanks for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the huge number of people that came along tonight. Tribute to Kate's influence and popularity. The next event, which is kind of in keeping with the spirit of this, obviously 2020 has been a very grim year in a lot of ways, but one of the kind of most uplifting elements in the philosophy world has been the publication of The Philosopher Queens, which was a book that asked the question, where are the women philosophers? Unfortunately, there's not a chapter on Kate's work yet. Perhaps if there's a Philosopher Queens 2 published in a couple of years, it will be the subject for. But anyway, we're delighted to be hosting the book launch for it this Thursday. So there's a link to the registration thing in the chat function. So I think that's everything I need to say. I'm so delighted to have Chiara as the interlocutor tonight. She's such a great person to work with, and Kate, who's really influenced me in her philosophy. It's been a really lovely evening. So thank you both very much.
Thanks so much.
And,
Yeah.
I'll bring up the slide just to end it with details of the next event. So thank you, and I'll sign off now.